Hello, Max Wright here, and I just want to respond to a video I just saw. It was it's on a YouTube channel called The Justicar, and the video is titled Taxation is Theft, a rebuttal to the claim made by libertarians. And in it, the gentleman basically, step one, acknowledges that most libertarians would argue that taxation is theft, agreed. He then goes on to say that this is invalid because in the case of a sales tax, for example, like a GST or a value-added tax or something like that, the consumer knows before the transaction takes place, he knows that there is a tax in there. So he knows that the terms and conditions of this transaction are that there is a component for tax. So you can't very well enter into a contract where you know all of the terms and conditions up front, complete the transaction, get to the other end and say, oh, hang on a minute, I was just a victim of theft because there was a tax in there. In the case of income tax, it's a similar kind of claim. He says that you know that if you work and earn money, you're going to have to pay income tax. So if you can't very well choose to work, knowing the terms and conditions up front, get to the other end and say, hang on a minute, there was a theft taking place. And so I'd like to make a rebuttal to that argument, if I may. And to do it, it's a very, hopefully, far better than just learning something from this particular point. I hope you get the technique and the gift to get yourself through a lot of questions like this. And the technique is to just try and come up with as close an analogy as possible, but taking the government out of it. So I'll do that in a minute. But the goal here is because as you go, if you end up doing half a dozen of these and applying this to taxation equals theft and applying it to a lot of other libertarian principles, what you'll realize is that as soon as you add the term government, the vast majority of people, what they do is they inverse morality. So something that is clearly immoral when it's just a handful of individuals acting, when you put the government in there doing exactly the same thing, it magically becomes moral. And when you start to notice this trend amongst the vast majority of people, that the immoral magically becomes moral as soon as government's involved, you start to put the pieces together. You start to ask yourself a question: am I like indoctrinated? Why is it every time the word government's applied to exactly the same situation that I know is immoral, my instinct, my gut, is to reverse it and make it moral? And I think that once you get through a little bit of it, you'll realize that trend is there, and you'll realize that the government can't make things immoral just by virtue of it being government. It's actually an indoctrination. It's a result of the fact that government took over education 150 years ago, and for generation after generation, we all spend the vast majority of our formative years inside government institutions. And it's the same way, I mean, you look at religious people, you take kids and immediately you're baptizing them and you're taking them off to church, and they're in this environment for year after year after year. And you get to the end of it, it's like things that are obviously crazy in the normal world, attach the word God to it, and it becomes, well, no, that's probably the truth. Things that are obviously untrue in the real world become somehow truth as soon as you attach God to it. And so it's a very clear analogy, and you'll see it as you get used to it. So let me get to it. So let's try and come up with an example that is as close an analogy as possible to a sales tax that doesn't have government in it. And so I came up with something. Imagine you're at the school cafeteria, and this is the scene you witness. There's a line of small children. Let's say it's an elementary school. There's a line of small children lining up to get to the cafeteria and buy their donuts and their milk and whatever else, and they got their money in their hand. Right beside the cafeteria, there's a bully. Let's say he came from high school. He's a big bully, right? And he's got a sign there because he couldn't be bothered telling all of the little kids. And the sign says, "Dear children, please be aware there will be a dollar tax associated with each transaction that takes place at this cafeteria. If you want to buy a donut, you got to buy the donut and pay me $1." Now, would you look at that scene and say, let's say you're the teacher at the school. Would you look at that scene and say, well, the sign is there. All of the kids know the details of the transaction, the terms and conditions of the transaction before they line up. They know what they're going to get. I guess this is moral. No problems. As a teacher, how can I help this? How can I help facilitate this? Children, put your dollar in your left hand for the bully and put the exact change in your hand for the cafeteria, and we'll speed this line along. Is that what you would do? Or would you look at it and say, this is immoral? Now, from here, hopefully you can join the dots. For a lot of people, this will be a little bit insulting to keep going from here. But because it's a video and I don't get the opportunity to get feedback, I'll take this through to completion. So some people well, first of all, if you think that scene is moral, then that's kind of the end of the conversation, because you and I just have different ideas of immorality. But if you can see that, no, hang on, a bully just interjecting himself, standing at the front of a transaction saying, I want to take a piece, charge a fee, that is clearly immoral. Now, are there any areas that this analogy does break down when you go back to the government scenario? Is there any areas where it's wrong? And some people might say that, well, yeah, actually, there is a difference, because governments provide goods and services for their tax, whereas the bully is just taking the money. So, okay, let's improve the analogy a touch. If the bully says, I'm going to give you a massage for 2 minutes for this $1, and he gives a massage for 2 minutes every time someone walks past, would you now say that the situation is moral? And of course, hopefully, the answer is no. And now you get into so you can kind of go down the path of, well, that's not a real, that's not a real advantage. Some people don't like that service, but that's a very good analogy to the institution, the government services that they provide. A lot of people don't like the services that governments provide. So that's a really, really tight analogy. And when it's on an individual basis, it just jumps out at you that clearly this is immoral. But in the instance of government, all of a sudden we flip it in our heads and we go, this is moral, this is virtuous. And all of a sudden you're blaming the victims. Like, well, if the kids lined up in the line, they knew the terms and conditions, they can't complain about it. No, of course not. They can complain about it. So hope this helps. I could do the same thing for income tax, but it's exactly the same analogy. You want to work for somebody, there's a guy standing at the front, give me half your income. It's no problem. You know it's wrong. You know it's immoral. The question for yourself is, why do you not see it? And then you really got to go back to the indoctrination stuff I was talking at the very beginning, because it's blindingly obvious when it's pointed out. So hope this helps, and actually have another question there. I'm going to respond to that video as well. See you soon.